So around 2 in 3 people in this country do think that we should renationalise energy, and I do agree with that. And the reason for that is, it wasn't that long ago that we actually had publicly owned energy in the first place, and publicly owned energy is a natural monopoly, and what that means is that we all need it. You can't choose not to use energy, really. If you want to live in the modern world, you have to.
Yeah, it's an essential service.
Yes. So that means it's a monopoly. And what happened under the Conservatives when Margaret Thatcher was Prime Minister was that they wanted to create an artificial market. So they sort of allowed for energy suppliers, which is companies that we have now that take the energy supply and then sell it on to customers. And so it was this kind of experiment of trying to privatise an essential service. And I think what we can see now from what's been happening in the last few months is that experiment has failed, and we actually need to go back to public ownership, because I think that, we can't have this situation where energy companies are going bust and where customers' bills are increasing by massive percentages, particularly during winter. We actually have to think about what is best for the people of this country. And I think it's that we need to be able to own the energy firms so that all of the profits can be reinvested back into the energy system, and we can make sure that we keep bills low.
But isn't this more, because I get it, I get the sentiment of, yes, it's essential, and now I don't want my energy or gas or whatever it is to be funding fat cats. That's what people say, fat cats. So let's get it out of there, let's get it into the government. But isn't that more ideological than kind of fact-based, evidence-based? Because if I think back to when energy, well, not me, obviously, so I'm way too young, but if one would like to kind of think back to when it was nationalised, you had things like frequent blackouts, you had frequent disruption of energy supplies, and actually those things now, they've not gone away, but they've certainly reduced the investment. When you look at the amount of investment that's gone into much of this infrastructure, that has increased as well in the private sector. So evidence-based, it's not really the same as the sentiment.
Actually, when Margaret Thatcher became Prime Minister, the first thing she did was she walked into the cabinet room and she threw this book down by a man called Friedrich Hayek. Is that right, Laurie?
Yes, that's correct.
And she said, this is what we believe. And that was a very ideological book that suggested that we needed to take things out of public ownership and actually privatise all of them. So the move to privatise in the first place was based on ideology. It wasn't based on evidence. And I think if you want evidence that the private market is not failing, just ask your average viewer. I would just ask your average viewer to think about their energy bills and how much they've gone up recently.
Yeah, they've gone up hugely.
Mine have gone up by £60 just this year. So, and I can luckily afford to pay that, but there's obviously millions of families in this country that would be devastating.
So, Ali, is the answer to this then giving it to the government?
No, I don't think it is. I think, look, in the short term, the government is going to have to take some action. I'm a bulb customer. When I left the house this morning, the heating was still on. And the lights were still on. I hope that that's the case when I go home.
Well, courtesy of us, the taxpayers, it will be.
Thank you very much. It's very kind.
I'm paying your energy.
Indeed. Thank you. But look, I think that the government needs to provide, in this particular case, it's in special administration. I think that there are two issues here. One is that the energy price cap at the moment by the regulator, Ofgem, is only reset twice a year. That clearly, in a situation where you have acute spikes in energy markets.
When's the next one?
I think it's next March or April.
Yeah, April.
Acute spikes in energy markets that we're having now. You have a global supply issues on energy and price issues on energy because we're waking up from this COVID-19 pandemic. You also have supply issues with Russia building its gas, about to seek regulatory approval for its Nord Stream 2 gas pipeline coming into Germany. And you're also having a conversation for the first time in years about small modular reactors, now nuclear reactors, to try and increase energy security in the country. So there's a complex picture when it comes to energy issues here. But I think the price cap is one, and I think it should be looked at much more frequently, particularly in a time like this. And I think the other issue is that people need to be allowed to have choice. The whole reason why the market was liberalised in the first place was because the profit motive was felt to actually increase competition, give people more choice. If people want to actually invest in companies they feel that are going to give them a better deal, they should. The problem is that a lot of those smaller companies cannot hedge their exposure in financial markets to volatility in gas and electricity markets, and that's the problem, because their credit ratings are not sufficiently high enough for banks to do business with them. And that is a problem that the government has to look at addressing in some way.
Yeah, and Laurie, what do you think about because I worry, I've got a couple of examples here, by the way, about where this has indeed happened. So one of them, Bristol Energy, that was earned, or at least majority earned, or 36.5 million pounds worth of taxpayers' money went into that venture. You might as well have opened a bucket with a hole in, poured it in, and end of that money. Because that was a real example, current day, of the public sector getting involved and failing miserably, some might say.
That was the instance of a local council, all of which had been cut to the bone, trying to set up an energy company to deal with two problems. The fact that the big suppliers, because they aren't actually exposed to the competition they're supposed to be, were overcharging people. They were scamming people, particularly vulnerable communities. And this is a misconception, investment in the energy market, right, in getting cheaper forms of energy, in making sure that we're not reliant on things like gas, in insulating homes, collapsed after the privatisation. The level of investment was far higher before privatisation occurred, and that almost fell off a cliff. So this was an example of a local council, in the case of Bristol, trying to sort out those problems. But councils have got and it'll probably
Together Energy,
probably a local council.
That was Warrington, that second
one. And they've not got
Warrington's had massive cuts.
They've not got the ability to do this properly. And we find ourselves
in favour of nationalisation?
We're in a situation where the idea that you can have an effective market in energy, something that we all rely on, as Ellie is saying, and something that requires vast amounts of investment, to make happen. We can just band together tomorrow and be like, do you know what? We are going to either build massive energy assets like new power plants or whatever, or buy massively on markets to get energy. It's very difficult to do that. So the elements have competition. Like if we were going to set up a business on Etsy or something to sell the glasses that we made or something, it's far easier than with energy companies. So these councils sort of heroically were trying to set up these things, but they didn't have the resources to make it happen. Nationally, we do have the resources to make that happen. I must also just add that there have been some councils that have set up companies that have been riotously successful as well.
Are you in favour of, say, like the National Grid as an example? Are you in favour of the National Grid being put into public ownership?
Yeah.
Are you?
The grid itself, right, so which is separate then to the people who are putting electricity through the grid, right?
It is.
For those who don't know about it. Yes, because why should you be making money out of moving things, that electricity in this case, that we absolutely need? There are also then companies, right? So the National Grid sends it around the country and then it goes down to the local area, and that's a different company. And many of those companies are owned offshore. Their money goes through tax havens. They overcharge us. This is pretty wild stuff.
But fundamentally, what it comes down to is capital investment in the infrastructure of the country, right? So the government has got a lot of other things to do. It's also presently got 2 trillion of public debt to deal with and 400 billion of borrowing on the back of the pandemic to deal with, and taxes are going up, inflation's going up, and interest rates are going to go up. So if you want real investment in the infrastructure in the country, it's perfectly fine to allow private sector companies to do it. However, you're right, Michelle, talking about monopolistic issues. It is a monopoly kind of situation, particularly with the grid.
That was Ellie.
So that's why you have regulation. That is the point, that customers don't get ripped off, and that's why you have regulators that allow the investors to make a reasonable return, and they have parameters of what that reasonable return looks like, and they allow that capital investment to come in. You're right about...
But none of that's worked, is it?
Can I just say, if you're a viewer of this programme, please will you message Michelle and tell her whether you think you've been ripped off by your energy company
or not. Of course, all of you will probably do. But you'll be more familiar than I, probably, Ellie. I think it was in 2019, Labour in their manifesto did this policy about how they're going to nationalise energy, bring in energy home or whatever it was called. And one of the key statements that it was talking about in there, and I couldn't get over the audacity of it, I've got to be honest, was when they were talking about they were going to buy back the assets that belong to people like National Grid and some of the big organisations, and they were going to buy them back, and I don't think this is a direct quote, I've got to be honest, but along the lines, and they were going to buy them back at a substantial discount to market rates. Do you know what I'm talking about in the manifesto?
Yeah, vaguely, yeah.
So Labour had this pie-in-the-sky idea about this is how we're going to do it. We're going to take it into public ownership. We're not going to pay the market value of these assets. And people were celebrating and clapping and cheering that notion. And I find it, and I don't know if you know what I'm talking about and you support that, but I find it so bizarre that someone would be advocating going to a private organisation and telling them that they're going to buy their assets from them at a below market value, and completely overlooking the fact that actually, when you look at where pensions are invested, lots of pensions are invested in lots of these organisations. So basically ripping off, it's fleecing anyway, it's not ripping off, you're fleecing these private organisations to take hold of their assets because you think that you can at a market rate, at a discount. And the people that would suffer from that are people like my viewers, people that have pensions. The pensions are invested in these organisations.
But that's not the only way that you could do that, right?
It's not my way. This was the strategy that was proposed.
Sure, and maybe that wasn't the best strategy, but there are other ways to make this happen.
I actually didn't think that Labour's energy policy in 2019 was very good.
Didn't you? Good. Well, we agree on that. I didn't either.
But, I mean, I am in favour of, like, public ownership. I just don't think that what they were suggesting was great. Anyway, sorry, Laura, I interrupted you.
But yeah, look, in a situation where we've had a dearth of investment in what we need to meet our energy needs in this country, to make sure people have well-insulated homes and all these kind of things, the model we've had for the last 30 to 40 years hasn't worked. So we need to do something different.
Welcome to the GB News YouTube channel. You can watch us live 24 hours a day, catch up on your favourite shows, and join in the conversation in the comments below.
Don't forget to subscribe and you'll never miss any of our exclusive content.